On September 29th, 2023, in Española, New Mexico, a man was shot by an individual wearing a Make America Great Again hat. The incident was linked to tensions surrounding the proposed reinstallation of a statue of Spanish conquistador Juan de Oñate, drawing attention to the contentious portrayal of historical figures associated with conquest and genocide. Oñate's brutal treatment of indigenous peoples is reminiscent of older, deeply rooted social hierarchies and power imbalances. Reactionary forces have long since insisted on placing statues of people who presided over mass murder in places of honor in their communities, and marginalized communities and their allies have gained more attention in advocating for their removal. The 2020 Black Lives Matter uprising represent the latest and to date most successful attempts of marginalized people in America to remove symbols that represent the people who have harmed their communities in the past. Oñate's relevance as a historical figure can be traced back to the early exploits of Christopher Columbus and the Spaniards in the Caribbean. These ventures not only marked a dark period in human history, but also set the stage for significant shifts in economic systems, leading to the emergence of modern capitalism. Prior to Columbus and 16th century colonialism, Europe was deeply anchored in a feudal economy, defined by its agrarian focus, regional trade, and a strict hierarchy between lords and serfs. But as conquistadors pillaged resource-rich lands, the influx of commodities like gold and silver transformed European economies, leading to the rise of mercantilism, which emphasized raw wealth accumulation. This mercantilist era planted the seeds for imperialism and capitalism for centuries to come. Whether serfs in Europe, exploited indigenous populations, or enslaved Africans, visible as a clear human pattern. The powerful will always be eager to let economic pursuits overshadow human well-being. The elevation of figures like Columbus or Oñate, despite brutal legacies, underscores deeper societal issues. Their veneration is tied to larger societal values, power dynamics, and historical narratives. These narratives, crafted by dominant groups, often frame national identities, support prevailing power structures, or push specific ideologies. Such figures are revered not just for their deeds, but for their symbolism and tales of conquest and nation-building. Throughout history, those in power have molded stories to their advantage, deliberately obfuscating transgressions to create a narrative that fits contemporary needs. To be fair, this manner of selective historical representation isn't unique to any one culture or era. It's a recurrent theme throughout human history. The recent shooting in New Mexico serves as a harsh spotlight upon deeper historical forces that have shaped our societies. To comprehend such an act, we must delve into the foundations of why certain historical figures are celebrated, while others are denigrated or erased. This requires societies to confront and critically examine their intrinsic values and biases. In our current era, where history is frequently harnessed as a tool for political and ideological battles, such introspection becomes even more vital. For us to grasp how issues of racism and inequality have ensnared the globe, it's essential to trace back the origins of these systemic power structures. A pivotal moment in this historical trajectory was the arrival in the Americas of Christopher Columbus on behalf of the Spanish Empire. Columbus wasn't merely an explorer. He was a harbinger of a new world order. The choices he made, driven equally by his own hubris as by the ambitions of the Spanish crown, laid the groundwork for centuries of colonization, exploitation, and cultural dominance. His interactions with the indigenous people, marked by subjugation and a fervent quest for wealth, set a precedent for colonial ventures worldwide. Understanding Columbus's actions and the broader implications of his voyages provides a foundational lens to view the rise of European colonial empires and their lasting impacts on global power dynamics. These empires didn't merely redraw maps. They reconfigured societies, economies, and cultures. They installed hierarchies based on race, justified by a sense of cultural and racial superiority. This colonial legacy has left indelible imprints, many of which are still palpable today, manifesting as racial prejudices, economic disparities, and cultural biases. In sum, to truly understand the modern world, with all its intricacies and disparities, one must journey back to seminal moments like Columbus's arrival and the subsequent enfolding of the colonial era. The first questions we have to answer are, why would the Spanish want to extend their empire to other continents, and how were they able to? To begin to answer this, we have to go back to 2 years before a pivotal moment in Christian history, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire in 1453. Constantinople, once the resplendent capital of the Byzantine Empire and the final beacon of the Roman legacy, stood tall through centuries of sieges and challenges until its eventual fall. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II, with his powerful Ottoman army, achieved what many before him could not, breaching the formidable Theodosian walls, largely with the help of his elite troops, the Janissaries. As Constantinople's defenses crumbled, Constantine XI Pelagius met a heroic end in battle, marking the irrevocable fall of a city that bridged the ancient and medieval worlds. This event was not only viewed as a portent of an impending apocalypse by the Christian world, but it also severely impacted European trade routes. Constantinople's strategic location between Asia and the Mediterranean made it a critical port city, controlling access through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. Before its fall, Christian dominance over Constantinople allowed Europe direct access to the spices and textiles from Asia. With the Ottoman capture of the city, trade routes were heavily taxed and controlled, placing Europe at a disadvantage. During Columbus's formative years, the prevailing sentiment in Europe was an urgency to reclaim these Christian territories, or at least regain direct control of the lucrative trade routes to China and India. Entering this tale is the renowned Cristoforo Colombo. What, you've never heard of him? Ah, perhaps you know him by the name the ever-creative English bestowed upon him, Christopher Columbus. You see, our dear friends upon their barren rock have this charming habit of taking something perfectly good and changing it to suit their own idiosyncratic needs. Don't worry, they never did it again. Cristoforo Colombo was born in 1451 in the Republic of Genoa, now modern-day Italy. Though the specifics of his early life are vague, it's believed he hailed from a modest family of wool weavers. Growing up around the bustling ports of Genoa, Colombo developed a deep passion for the sea. This very city, the dominant Italian city-state of his time, was heavily involved in the slave trade, a dark practice that greatly bolstered its economy. In Columbus, a biography by Lawrence Bergreen, the city's deep-rooted dependency on slavery is vividly depicted, highlighting the widespread exploitation and particularly egregious sexual abuses of the era. Understanding the context of Genoa's societal norms is pivotal to comprehending the actions and decisions of Colombo. By age 14, Colombo began working as a sailor, quickly learning the perils of sea life and warfare among Italian city-states. His travels took him to various parts of Europe, and while in Lisbon, he mingled with the Genovese expatriates, influencing his ambitions and worldviews. In the late 1840s, Colombo participated in a voyage to Ghana, which was under Portuguese control. During this time, Portugal had an exclusive trading monopoly along the West African coast due to papal decrees. This trading monopoly also granted Portugal the authority to enslave pagans and Muslims they encountered in the region. Interestingly, this form of slavery was based on religious distinctions, not racial ones. Andrés Reséndez is a professor of history at the University of California, Davis. His 2016 book, The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America, offers an exhaustively researched account of the development of how European slavery practices developed in the Atlantic world. His book sheds light on Colombo's familiarity with the Portuguese slave trade, indicating that before Colombo's journeys to the New World, he had already been deeply intertwined with the practices and nuances of the slave trade, from Geneva to Ghana. Christopher Columbus's voyages have given rise to numerous myths and misconceptions over the centuries. Notably, contrary to a widely held belief, Colombo and the learned individuals of his time were well aware that the earth was round, dispelling the narrative that they believed in a flat world. However, where Colombo made a significant error was in his geographical estimations. He believed Asia could be reached more quickly by sailing westward, but he vastly underestimated the size of the earth. How could he have made such a massive error? Colombo's underestimation of Earth's size resulted from several mistakes and biases. He based his geography on ancient sources like Ptolemy, whose measurements for Earth's circumference were significantly off. Colombo also mistakenly equated the shorter Roman mile with the longer Arabic mile, further reducing his distance estimate to Asia. He also displayed a selective use of data, often cherry-picking pieces of information that supported his beliefs, while ignoring estimates that were much closer to Earth's actual size. Moreover, despite many educated Europeans believing the Earth to be larger than Colombo's estimates, he would blithely dismiss these contrary opinions. So, in essence, if the Americas, continents he had no knowledge of, hadn't been there, he would have simply died on his voyages. The advisors of the Spanish monarchs, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, knew this, and Colombo was at first rejected. He persisted, even demanding not just the title of Admiral of the Ocean Seas, but also perpetual governance over lands he'd discover. He petitioned Queen Isabella for about 6 years, and during this period he lived in Spain, trying to secure support for his transatlantic expedition. Isabella relented in 1492, as the capture of Granada in southern Spain marked the ending of the Reconquista. So what was the Reconquista? The Caliphate of Cordoba, a flourishing and enlightened civilization, shone as the jewel of the world, radiating tolerance and boasting one of the highest standards of living in the medieval era. So, naturally, the Catholics wanted to destroy it utterly. The Reconquista was a centuries-long military campaign in the Iberian Peninsula that began in the early 8th century, where the Catholic monarchs of the small kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal would wage war against the Muslims of Cordoba and Granada in southern Spain. As the centuries progressed, smaller Christian kingdoms would merge through marriages and would conquer more and more Muslim land. The cultural and political mechanisms refined during the Reconquista were ruthlessly transplanted to the Americas by Spanish and Portuguese colonizers, leading to a devastating legacy of cultural genocide. These mechanisms, marked by military conquest, zealous religious conversion, centralized control, and exploitative land distribution, were wielded to annihilate indigenous civilizations and forcibly replace their cultures with European norms. The Inquisition in Iberia forcibly separated Muslims and Jews from their religious freedoms, confiscated their property, and subjected them to persecution and expulsion, resulting in the loss of their cultural and religious heritage. A remarkably similar process would be applied to the Americas, stripping indigenous peoples of their languages, traditions, and beliefs. Therefore, as the Reconquista came to an end, the newly unified Spanish crown had a massive and now idle war machine at its disposal, built for conquering and forcibly converting subject populations. It wasn't just Colombo's excessive nagging that made Isabella give him ships. It was a desire for more land to conquer that convinced her to take the risk. Amid the political circumstances that led Colombo to secure a fleet, it's noteworthy to consider the technological advancements that converged at the time, making such transoceanic voyages feasible. The crossing of vast oceans and exploration of the unknown seas was a remarkable convergence of global technologies, many of which had non-European origins. Key to this maritime revolution were innovations such as the stern post rudder and the magnetic compass, both inventions birthed in China. These groundbreaking technologies made navigation more precise and control of ships in the open sea more manageable. The Arab world, known for its rich history of seafaring and trade, adopted these tools, enhancing their maritime capabilities. When Europeans, particularly in the Iberian Peninsula, interacted with the Arabs, they inherited these inventions, adding to their growing arsenal of seafaring tools. The lateen sails, a distinct triangular sail design, had been pivotal in the Indian Ocean for ages, allowing ships to harness the wind and sail against it, granting mariners unparalleled flexibility in choosing their routes and direction. This was a significant advantage when unpredictable winds or adverse conditions were encountered. The astrolabe, though of ancient Greek origin, served as another crucial navigation tool. With it, sailors could measure the angle of the stars above the horizon, and thereby accurately determine their latitude, which was essential for open sea navigation without the reference of landmarks. With these non-European technologies in hand, and combined with their own innovations like the caravel, a robust ship with a spacious hull and 3 masts, European explorers were equipped to embark on epic voyages. On August 3rd, 1492, Colombo began his most well-known voyage with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. On October 12th, when Cristoforo Colombo first set foot on an island close to Hispaniola, he executed a pivotal symbolic act. Acting on behalf of Spain, he ceremoniously claimed the newfound land in the name of the Catholic monarchs King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. He describes the Taino as so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with anyone. They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk spells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made with cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. On December 5th, Colombo's small fleet landed on a large island. Several 100,000 Taino inhabitants called the island home, and their word for it was Haiti, which means mountainous land. The Spanish unfortunately showed little interest in preserving the stories or the languages of the people they would murder. Colombo decided to call the place Hispaniola. Consequently, our understanding is largely shaped by Colombo's accounts of the region and its inhabitants. At first, Colombo endeavored to establish a positive rapport with the indigenous Taino and Arawak peoples by distributing trinkets as detailed in his journals. However, to fully appreciate the interactions, one must view them from the indigenous perspective. Having never seen manufactured glass, these trinkets could have appeared exceptionally rare and precious to the Taino, possibly even surpassing the value of gold in their eyes. Spanish accounts from time to time might depict amusement at the natives trading gold for perceived simple trinkets, highlighting the subjectivity of value. Yet, for all of Colombo's documentation of the indigenous culture, his overriding focus would unmistakably be on gold and colonization potential. He often marginalized their intricate social structures, religious beliefs, and agricultural systems, envisioning the newfound lands primarily as a canvas for the Spanish Empire's ambitions. Driven by financial gain, his communications to Isabella and Ferdinand about the territory's potential consistently underscored their worth in terms of imperial expansion and monetary returns. Early in their voyages, Colombo and the Spaniards decided to kidnap indigenous people. This was driven by a mix of practical and imperial motivations. Early in his exploration, Colombo believed that captives could serve as valuable guides to help navigate the unfamiliar terrain and bridge linguistic gaps. These actions also displayed a show of dominance, emphasizing European power over the indigenous populations. Colombo's intrigue with their culture led him to envision them as novelties to be showcased in the Spanish court, while also considering their potential as slaves. As the men of the Caribbean resisted this, Colombo employed a calculated strategy of taking female captives to ensure the compliance of indigenous men he had already detained or intended to detain. Recognizing cultural and emotional ties between family and community members, he believed that the presence of women and children from their own communities would make the men more tractable, especially during their impending journey and stay in Spain. This tactic is clearly articulated in the statement, "Afterwards I sent to a house which is in the area of the river to the west, and they brought back 7 head of women, small and large, and 3 children. I did this because the men would comport themselves better in Spain, having women from their land, than without them." Colombo characterized the indigenous inhabitants as innocent and sheltered, emphasizing their naivete and inexperience with malevolence. He conveyed to the queen the dual benefits of their conversion to Christianity, spiritual salvation, and a strategic advantage for Spain. Spotting modest gold trinkets among the natives, Colombo inferred a richer gold source in the region than actually existed. Though traditionally the indigenous sourced gold from riverbeds, Colombo deemed structured mining as the key to procuring significant wealth. While conversion might offer some protection against outright enslavement, Colombo pondered other exploitative means like coerced labor in gold mines as a form of tribute. By November 11th, upon reaching what is now Cuba's shores, he mistakenly thought it to be Japan, his hopes of vast gold reserves were high. Yet, finding mainly natives with modest gold adornments, he pivoted, increasingly seeing the people themselves as the primary assets to be exploited. His communications emphasized their perceived vulnerability, subtly positioning themselves as tools rather than as autonomous individuals. His journal entries of December 16th demonstrate what his intentions had evolved into. He viewed the indigenous population as pliable, expecting them to assimilate into European culture and occupy subservient positions in a newly imagined social order. In late November, Martín Alonso Pinzón, the captain and owner of the Pinta, separated from the fleet due to personal motivations. While many of these ships were owned by individuals, they operated in service to the Spanish crown. Martin Pinzón was instrumental in recruiting crew, as he was a revered sailor in Palos. The expeditions largely owed their logistical success to Pinzón and his brothers. Testimonies from crew members and related court documents suggest he managed the daily operations of the voyage, a role Colombo wasn't at all adept at. Around Christmas, doubts arose about Colombo's leadership capabilities when the Santa Maria wrecked near present-day Haiti. Colombo's explanation for the mishap varied over time. While initially he blamed holiday negligence, later he shifted the fault to a ship's boy, then to an unseen reef, and ultimately he suggested potential sabotage by the men of Palos. Yet amid these challenges, an unexpected ally emerged in the form of a cacique, a title akin to chief, named Giari. Giari's motivations remain debated. He might have perceived the Spaniards as semi-divine entities, or more pragmatically, recognized their formidable military prowess and hoped to ally with them for protection against regional enemies. Discovering a group of people flourishing in their health and happiness and feasting on amazing food, basically living the dream in their slice of paradise, and then thinking, you know what this scene needs? Some good old-fashioned forced labor, town planning, and pants. You have to have pants. With the sinking of the Santa Maria, Colombo now lacked the capacity to transport all his crew back to Spain. Ghiari's hospitality presented an opportunity. Colombo envisioned building a stronghold, marking the beginning of Spanish influence in the region. Ironically, he didn't deem it as a necessity for defense, but more as a testament to Spanish superiority, a reminder to the natives of their subordination. Consequently, he chose to leave 40 of his men behind, tasking them with founding a new settlement. This endeavor would exploit the labor of the local populace and prioritize gold collection for Spain. To the astonishment of many, the crew, who once feared staying in uncharted lands, now eagerly vied for the chance to remain. As Colombo readied for his return voyage on the Niña, heated discussions among the crew focused on who would get to stay on the island. Well, their past attempts to loot Taino villages, which led the Taino to evacuate their homes upon seeing foreign ships, were a stark contrast to the newfound desires of these Spanish sailors to remain. On January 2nd, 1493, as Colombo began his journey back, the local cacique beseeched him to stay for protections against their foes, the Caribs. Nonetheless, Colombo left, naming the outpost La Navidad, and conveyed in a letter to the Spanish monarchy his anticipation of discovering abundant gold and spices upon his return. After Colombo safely returned to Castile, the indigenous individuals he had captured and the artifacts he had brought from the Caribbean garnered significant attention and admiration from his sovereigns. However, he had yet to deliver on his promise of discovering a reliable gold source. Consequently, he began to exaggerate and even fabricate details to amplify his achievements in alignment with his sovereigns' interests. As Lawrence Bergreen highlights, Columbus presented his carefully crafted journal, designed not as an accurate record, but rather as a propaganda tool to persuade his monarchs into a specific course of action. He aimed to convince them that, with a larger fleet, he could expand the initial settlement and establish a chain of towns, churches, abbeys, and fortresses. These would serve as gold collection points, given the indigenous population's new subjugation to the crown. Furthermore, in a bid to popularize his discoveries, Colombo not only handed his journal to the sovereigns, but also published a letter translated into multiple European languages, effectively announcing the New World to Europe. His emphasis on the region's potential was largely self-serving, giving his legal entitlement to a portion of all trade from the area. Moreover, while gold was a focal point, Colombo also accentuated the human resources he discovered, while frequently commenting on the physical attractiveness of the indigenous people. Ew. Word of his so-called discoveries spread quickly. These new islands, being non-Christian, were seen by the Catholic Church as lands to be divvied up among Christian nations. Recognizing the potential for territorial disputes between Spain and Portugal in particular, the era's dominant Catholic powers, Pope Alexander VI took the lead. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed, formalizing the Pope's demarcation, a line stretching from the north to south poles, 100 leagues west and south of the Azores. While areas to the west of this line were designated for Spain, the east was for Portugal. Colombo, owing to his agreement with Spain, stood to gain from Spanish colonization in these territories. But the Treaty of Tordesillas emerged as a significant diplomatic oversight. Its goal was to ensure Portugal's unobstructed access to Africa, while designating the expansive Americas to Spain. Yet, due to limited geographical understanding and the difficulties of accurate demarcation, the treaty inadvertently granted Portugal a very large chunk of South America, today's Brazil. As Portugal recognized this advantageous error, they moved swiftly to colonize the region, leading to Brazil's unique status as a Portuguese-speaking enclave in a predominantly Spanish-speaking continent. In the meantime, as Colombo's fame was soaring, he prepared for a second much grander voyage of discovery and conquest. On May 20th, 1493, he was granted the additional title of Admiral of the Seven Seas by the Catholic monarchs of Spain. This title expanded his authority beyond just the Atlantic Ocean and the newly discovered lands, recognizing his achievements and contributions to Spain's empire. He not only ascended into the nobility, but also ensured that these privileges would extend to his progeny. Additionally, the monarchs granted him the power to impose taxes on the natives and mete out punishment when deemed necessary. Nevertheless, there were explicit stipulations on Colombo's contact towards the indigenous people. The king and queen mandated that their conversion to Christianity was paramount. More importantly, they emphasized the humane treatment of the natives. The written instructions explicitly prohibited any form of mistreatment and demanded their respectful and affectionate care. While the instructions appeared progressive, underlying them was the troubling notion of the natives as the crown's property, warranting protection merely as assets. This second voyage was to be modeled on the Portuguese approach in Africa, which centered on establishing trade depots and making profits. From just 3 ships and 100 people in his first journey, Colombo's fleet expanded to 17 ships, with around 1,200 crew members for the second. This massive backing had a single primary objective: gold. While spices were also on the agenda, given the known riches of the East Indies, gold remained the primary obsession. This was Spain's grand venture, hoping for monumental cash returns. Upon his return to the Caribbean, Colombo faced adverse weather conditions, forcing him to make landfall on an island inhabited by the Cibao, or Caribs. These inhabitants had an antagonistic relationship with the Taino, whom Colombo had previously encountered. He observed the Taino displaying scars of past conflicts and was informed that they were the result of Cibao's raids. Colombo leveraged the perception of the Cibao as dangerous, even cannibalistic, as he informed his sovereigns of their potential threat. Now, this claim became a convenient justification for their enslavement, especially since his previous proposals to enslave the more peaceful Taino had been met with resistance from the monarchs. He saw the commercial advantage of selling slaves for quick profits. In his communications, Colombo listed the indigenous people, specifically the so-called cannibal Cibao, as one of the many resources alongside gold and spices that the New World had to offer. Well, this narrative allowed Colombo to categorize the Cibao as resources, stripping them of their humanity for financial gain. Sailing on, Colombo and his crew encountered a chilling sight: the settlement of La Navidad, which he had established on his prior voyage to Hispaniola, razed to the ground. The crew discovered the corpses, some of whom were their former shipmates, disturbingly, with their eyes removed. Seeking to understand the events that led to the destruction of La Navidad, Colombo sought to reconnect with the indigenous leaders he had previously befriended. A local leader who had been sympathetic to the Spanish, Cacique Giancari, reported what had transpired. In Colombo's absence, the soldiers of La Navidad had gone wild. They aggressively raided nearby villages, stole what they could, and raped and murdered the native inhabitants. They burnt the remains of any town they encountered to the ground. A Taino chieftain named Canaubo had spearheaded a united defense against the Spanish soldiers who wreaked havoc on the island. In a calculated response, Canaubo's forces ambushed and killed 10 Spanish soldiers. After this triumph, they marched on La Navidad, trapped the Spaniards inside, and burnt it to the ground. As cited in Resendez's The Other Slavery, Giancanagari assured Colombo of his non-involvement in the recent killings. He emphasized his continued amicability toward the Christians and reminded Colombo of his previous acts of kindness. He also spoke of the transgressions other caciques committed against him. Touched by Giancanagari's words and emotions, Colombo discerned a chance to leverage the pre-existing rifts among the native tribes and solidified an alliance with Giancanagari against shared foes. In spite of how evidently dangerous the Spanish had proven to be, Gian Canagari was still attempting to cultivate them as allies. Armed with guns, cannons, and the strategic use of dogs and horses, creatures unknown to the Americas, the Spanish held a clear advantage over the locals as bows and spears. Although the element of surprise might have been the natives' best weapons, tribal leaders like Gian Kanakagari thought they could use these powerful new allies against local adversaries, and hopefully be rewarded by maintaining their autonomy. But, as would recur again and again and again, in places like 16th century Mexico, 17th century North America, 19th century Africa, and beyond, the story is endless. European powers would exploit local divisions to conquer everyone. This is why solidarity is so important. Using superior weapons and fierce dogs, the Spanish dominated and subsequently enslaved a significant portion of the natives. Around 500 were immediately sent to Castile, marking the start of the Atlantic slave trade. Michel de Laconeo, an Italian on Colombo's second expedition, noted that of the 1,600 native captives, only 500 were sent to Spain, with the rest given to the colonists. Tragically, 200 died en route to Spain, with even fewer survivors upon arrival. This era shattered any illusions of peaceful coexistence, revealing the true nature of colonial exploitation and cruelty. On February 2nd, 1494, Cristoforo Colombo dispatched several ships from the newly christened outpost of Isabela back to Spain. These ships carried a substantial cargo of enslaved individuals and news of the establishment of this new colony. In spite of the instructions of Isabella and Ferdinand to not further enslave the population of the Americas, in the holds of these ships were hundreds of people who had been forcibly captured and were destined to be sold in the slave markets at Seville. In a letter to the monarchs, Colombo rationalized his actions, arguing that there was no common language for effective communication with indigenous people. He described these individuals as cannibals, both men and women, as well as boys and girls, whom he believed could be placed under the care of persons who could facilitate language acquisition. Colombo proposed that the profits from selling these individuals could be used to acquire European food, cattle, and other resources to be sent back to the Americas to support the colony. In essence, Colombo's argument was that European settlers were unwilling to consume American food, necessitating the sale of these enslaved people, whom he falsely portrayed as cannibals, to generate revenue for the purchase of European provisions and livestock. He further suggested to the Queen and King that they should consider capturing a significant number of indigenous males each year and an infinite number of indigenous women, asserting that one indigenous American individual was worth more than 3 African slaves from Guinea. Following the sovereign's critique of his enslavement practices, Colombo replaced it with a tax system, requiring individuals to fill a hawk's bell, previously a goodwill gesture, with gold every 3 months. To monitor compliance, residents wore metal discs around their necks as proof of payment of these taxes. Non-compliance resulted in enslavement, subjecting all indigenous individuals over 14 to this forced labor system. Accustomed to generations of their casual subsistence lifestyle, in a span of months, natives found themselves toiling under the harsh sun, sifting through sands for the diminishing grains of gold, or working tirelessly in the fields. Their nights, rather than offering respite, only served as a brief pause before another day of relentless labor. Resendez's accounts paint a vivid picture. Imagine the strain on your body when you're not just hauling dirt mixed with gold fragments, but also carrying your oppressors around in hammocks. It's not just a physical burden, but a profound humiliation, turning humans into beasts of burden quite literally. During the late 1490s and early 1500s, a gold fever swept through the Spanish, turning the newly discovered islands into centers of exploitation. This rampant greed was epitomized by tales of Spanish aristocrats using gold dust in salt shakers at extravagant feasts, a cruel irony for the enslaved islanders who witnessed the symbol of their oppression treated so frivolously. Colombo, in his attempts to justify the subjugation of the indigenous peoples, had falsely labeled them as captured cannibals, an explanation initially accepted by monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand. The concerns of the kings and the queens grew as ships supposedly carrying slaves returned to Seville filled with more dead than alive. Colombo's standing in the Spanish court waned, particularly after he suggested selling 4,000 slaves in a 1498 letter to the crown. To placate disgruntled colonists under his leadership, he gifted each a slave, resulting in 600 more Taino individuals being forced into bondage. It was evidently clear that Colombo faced any problem with enslaving more Taino and giving them to the Spanish. This was simply a panacea to whatever difficulties were being placed in front of him. Skepticism regarding Colombo's leadership and management in the New World fomented in the court. Once he established settlements, notably in Hispaniola, internal strife, rebellion from both Spanish settlers and indigenous groups, and punitive measures against dissenters became hallmarks of his governance. This mismanagement culminated in Colombo sending dissenting colonists back to Spain in chains, a move that starkly highlighted his leadership deficiencies. As noted, many of the ships returning to Spain carried nothing but the dead and the dying. Such grim scenes sparked questions about his motives and strategies. Antonio de Herrera y Tordesillas, a notable 16th century historian, echoed these concerns. Even as he recognized Colombo's achievements, Herrera's writings, particularly in Historia General de los Hechos de los Castellanos en las Islas y Tierra Firme del Mar Océano, highlighted several allegations against Colombo. Chief among these were claims that Colombo seemed reluctant to baptize the indigenous population, leading to speculation that his interests lay more in amassing slaves than in propagating Christianity. Allegations swirled that Colombo purposefully initiated conflicts, using them to justify further enslavement. Various individuals and groups raised concerns about his treatment of the native peoples. Among the most vocal were certain Catholic missionaries who were stationed in the newly discovered territories. Their primary aim was to spread Christianity and convert the indigenous populations, but they found that the brutality and injustices carried out by Colombo and his brothers significantly hampered these efforts. One notable figure who criticized Colombo was Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish Dominican friar. Originally a settler who benefited from the enslaved labor, he underwent a profound transformation and became a staunch defender of the indigenous peoples. He argued to anyone who would listen that such actions were not only antithetical to the teachings of Christianity, but also severely undermined the evangelizing mission of the Church. His appeals ultimately reached the Archbishop of Toledo and finally the King and the Queen. Ferdinand and Isabella felt the need to investigate the matter. Isabella, in particular, saw the inhabitants of the empire as her subjects whose souls she had a duty to save. By the close of the 15th century, she expressed profound personal dismay at those constant shipments of dead and dying people to Spain's shores. She liberated a substantial number of the survivors upon their arrival in Spain and presented them with the option to return to their native lands in the New World, and a majority of these emancipated individuals took it. The Spanish crown decided to strip Colombo of his titles as viceroy and governor, a clear sign of their diminishing confidence in his ability to effectively govern and manage the New World territories. They appointed Francisco de Bobadilla, a member of the Order of Calatrava, to investigate the complaints against Colombo in his administration. When Bobadilla arrived in Hispaniola, he was confronted with tales of the man from Genova's tyranny and mistreatment of both the indigenous Taino people and the Spanish settlers. After taking stock of the situation, Bobadilla ordered the arrest of Cristoforo and his two brothers, Diego and Bartholomew. In the only moment of justice they would ever face, not only were they arrested, but they were manacled and made the voyage back to Spain in chains, a deep humiliation for men of their stature. Colombo was granted an audience with Ferdinand and Isabella, during which he defended his actions and sought to restore his reputation. Though they were displeased with Colombo's governance, they recognized his contributions and perhaps felt the treatment by Bobadilla was excessive. Colombo was allowed to undertake a final voyage to the Americas in 1502. However, there were clear conditions. He was forbidden from stopping at Hispaniola at all, and was not granted the same powers he had enjoyed previously. Cristoforo Colombo passed away on May 20th, 1506. Despite his numerous missteps and misdeeds during his expeditions, he retained many of the privileges and rewards bestowed upon him by the Spanish crown. Additionally, a significant portion of these benefits were inherited by his sons. Unfortunately, the minor retributions he faced did little to change the fate of the indigenous populations he encountered, especially the Taino people. A complete sanitization of the Columbus myth might have been completed if not for the conscience of one of his contemporaries. Bartolomé de las Casas stands out as one of the most influential and poignant chroniclers of the injustices and brutalities the Spaniards inflicted on the indigenous people of the Caribbean. As previously noted, de las Casas was himself a beneficiary of the encomienda system, which granted Spanish settlers the labor and tribute of the indigenous people. However, witnessing the extreme brutality and inhumanity of Spanish actions firsthand deeply affected him. Haunted by the scenes of violence and exploitation, and consumed by guilt for his role in the conquest of Cuba, de las Casas underwent a profound personal transformation. This metamorphosis led him to relinquish his encomienda and pursue ordination as a priest. His new path became that of a fierce advocate for the rights and dignity of the Caribbean's indigenous inhabitants. His writings and accounts serve as one of the most detailed and condemning records of the Spanish colonial abuses. In his efforts to shed light on the grim reality and advocate for change, he penned numerous works, including a short account of the destruction of the Indies, where he meticulously documented the range of atrocities committed by the Spaniards. These documents, even centuries later, continue to be a crucial source for historians and researchers examining the early period of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. The following is an excerpt of de las Casas' accounts. The Spaniards first assaulted the innocent sheep like most cruel tigers, wolves, and lions, hunger-starved for the space of 40 years after their first landing. But the massacre of these wretches, whom they have so inhumanely and barbarously butchered and harassed, with several kinds of torments never before known or heard, that of 3 millions of persons which lived in Hispaniola itself, there is at present but the inconsiderable remnant of scarce 300. In the Isle of Hispaniola, the bloody slaughter and destruction of men first began, for they violently forced away women and children to make them slaves, and ill-treated them, consuming and wasting their food, which they had purchased with great work. One individual Spaniard would consume more food in one day than would serve to maintain 3 Taino families in a month. Now, being oppressed by such evil and afflicted with such torments, the Taino began to understand that men such as the Spaniards did not have a mission from heaven, and therefore some of them concealed their provisions and others to their wives and children in lurking holes, and some sought their refuge on the craggy tops of mountains. For the Spaniards did not only beat them, but laid violent hands also on the chief, and in time a certain captain was so audacious as to rape the consort of the king of the whole isle, from which time the Taino began to consider by what ways and means they might expel the Spaniards out of their country, and immediately took up arms. But, good God, what arms do you imagine? The weapons resemble reeds that boys play with one another more than steel arms and weapons. When the Spaniards saw this, they mounted on huge horses, armed themselves with lances and swords, and began to exercise their bloody butcheries and stratagems. They overran their cities and towns, spared no age, no sex, nay, not so much as woman with child, but ripping up their bellies, tore them alive in pieces. They laid wagers among themselves who should, with a sword at one blow, cut a man in two, or which of them could behead a man with the greatest skill, or which should sheath his sword in the bowels of a man with the quickest dispatch. They snatched young babes from mothers' breasts, and then dashed out the brains of these innocents against the rocks. Others they cast into rivers, scoffing and jeering them, and called upon their bodies when falling with derision. This is a true testament of their cruelty. To come to these people and inhumanely exposing them to their merciless swords, together with the mothers that gave them life. Resendez's narrative further offers a chilling depiction of this somber era. Pushed to despair, many indigenous individuals resorted to mass suicide, destroying food supplies and self-starvation to escape the colonizers' brutality. This account underscores the depth of hopelessness the indigenous people felt, leading many to view suicide as their sole refuge from the Spanish brutalities. The scale of this collective self-destruction was so vast that even the Spanish settlers struggled to comprehend its enormity. By the early 1500s, the Taino were virtually extinct, and many indigenous groups in the areas Colombo explored were decimated shortly after his arrival. While estimates vary, it's believed that around 300,000 people lived on Hispaniola when the Spanish arrived. Shockingly, by 1508, only about 60,000, or 20% of that number, remained, indicating a decline of 80% in just 16 years. This decline resulted from diseases, direct violence, and the harsh demands of the Spanish, especially their gold tribute system. The brutality exhibited by the Spanish in the early stages of their colonial expansion in the Americas was not an isolated event, but it marked the beginning of a prolonged era of exploitation and oppression. Both the Spanish and Portuguese empires, and later the French, English, Dutch, and ultimately American Empire, fueled by their thirst for riches and dominance, established systems that perpetuated immense cruelty, subjugation, and dehumanization. This new cycle of exploitation was not confined to direct physical violence. It took many forms, from the encomienda system, where indigenous people were subjected to forced labor under the guise of protection and conversion to Christianity, to the introduction of the transatlantic slave trade. The latter became one of the most harrowing episodes of human history, forcibly displacing millions of Africans to the Americas under the worst and most inhumane conditions imaginable, stripping them of their identities and subjecting them to generations of bondage. Beyond the immediate horrors these systems imposed, they also brought about profound socioeconomic, political, and cultural changes to the territories they touched. Indigenous populations were decimated by diseases introduced by Europeans, their cultures and traditions were often suppressed or eradicated, and entire civilizations with their rich histories and knowledge were pushed to the brink of extinction. These actions reshaped the face of continents, creating artificially drawn borders, fomenting racial and ethnic tensions, and instigating cycles of poverty and dependency that continue to persist in most parts of the globe. The legacies of these colonial endeavors, from institutionalized racism to economic inequality and to our culture wars, still reverberate today.